60 hours snowbound. One stove for 40 passengers. Deep in the second night, by the light of a brakeman's lantern, a young railroad man knelt in the aisle of a dead, dark passenger car and took the seats apart. One wrench, one axe, one armload at a time. Cushions here, frames there, backs and legs stacked like cordwood by the vestibule door. From the end of the car, passengers watched him do it. Men who had paid for those seats, women holding children wrapped in the cushions off of them. He was burning the train. And he was not burning it the way a desperate man burns things. He had a list in his head and a watch in his pocket, and an order he would not break for anyone on board. This car before that one, seats before doors, doors before window frames. So many sticks to the stove and not one stick more, no matter who was cold, no matter who was crying, no matter what the thermometer said. The brakeman was burning the seats in a strict order. To understand how the youngest man on the crew came to feed a passenger train into a stove, an armload an hour, while bankers and farm wives watched him and obeyed, you have to go back 2 days. To a bright, still, iron-cold noon in February of 1899 on a branch line in western Kansas. The coldest month anyone had ever measured was about to close its fist. February of 1899 did something to the middle of the country that the old people talked about for 50 years. Arctic air came down over the plains and stayed. Not a cold snap, a cold country laid down on top of the real one. Thermometers on porch posts read numbers nobody had seen before and then quit reading. Rivers froze that had never frozen, and under that iron sky the trains kept running because trains were the only thread holding the little towns to the world. The train that left the junction that Friday noon was nothing anybody would remember. A branch line accommodation, an engine and tender, a baggage car, 2 passenger coaches and a smoker. Some 40 souls aboard, bound west across the open country, a 4-hour run on a good day. The brakeman was Frank Delaney, 31 years old, 9 years on the road. A brakeman is the man nobody notices. He couples the cars, he throws the switches, he swings the lantern, he rides the cold end of the train. But Frank had come to the railroad out of the section gangs, where men work on the open line in every weather there is, and the section gangs had taught him one subject better than any man on that train knew it. Snow. What it does, what it weighs, what it wants, and what it costs a man who thinks he can walk through it. The passengers were the usual freight of a Plains local, a banker named Aldous Grange riding first-class manners in a second-class coach, a drummer named Pike, a traveling grocery salesman with 2 ham-sized sample cases and a joke for everyone, most of them bad, a bohemian settler woman, Mrs. Vacek, with 3 children and a basket, an old farm couple, the Otts, going to see a new grandchild, and over them all, the conductor, Hobbs, 58, master of the train the way a captain is master of a ship. They left in dead-still, cold and bright sun. By 2 o'clock, a ground wind had come up out of the northwest and set the whole prairie moving, snow running low and hard across the line like white water. By 3, the world was gone, and the engineer was driving into a snow-filled cut by feel. A cut is a kindness the railroad digs through a hill, and in a ground blizzard, it is a trap that fills itself. The engineer backed up and rammed it once, twice, throwing snow like surf. On the second run, the train stopped hard enough to throw people from their seats. It never moved again. The engine was buried past her rods, and in the lurch of that last stop, conductor Hobbs went off the vestibule steps onto the iced ballast, and his hip broke like a stick of kindling. They carried him in on a seat cushion, gray-faced, and the command of the train fell off him like a dropped coat. The engineer and the fireman held a short conference in the gangway and did the thing railroad men do. They took the line itself for a lifeline. A section house lay 4 miles ahead by the rail. 2 strong men walking the iron between the rails could make it and raise the wire and bring a plow. They wrapped up and went, and the storm took them in 20 steps, which left the train and the 40 and the storm to the youngest man on the crew. By dark, the storm had its full voice, and the train began to die of cold from both ends. The engine's fire went first. She had eaten her coal and water ramming drifts, and by morning she was a black iron corpse with icicles for breath. The coaches cooled behind her, one small stove apiece against a wind that pulled heat through every seam. Frost climbed the inside of the windows. The 40 sat wrapped in everything they owned and watched their breath. Then somebody saw the light. A farm light, somebody swore, off south, a half-mile, maybe less, glimpsed through a torn seam in the storm. A house, a stove. The talk ran down the car like fire down a fuse. A party could walk it. It was only a half-mile. Men stood up and buttoned their coats. Frank Delaney put himself in front of the door and said no. He said it as politely as a man can say it to men older and richer than himself, and he did not move. Nobody walks. Not a half-mile, not 100 yards. In a ground blizzard, the world is white to the end of your arm. A man loses the train in 10 steps and the world in 20. And the light he walks toward is not obliged to stay where he saw it. The prairie between here and that farm was full of men, other winters, who had been sure it was only a half-mile. The train was the only building on 40 miles of open ground, and everyone in it was already home. Aldous Grange, the banker, was not accustomed to the word no from trainmen. He organized his own party, 4 men, arms linked, his authority at the front like a flag. Frank did not fight them. He tied a line from the vestibule rail to Grange's belt, paid out the whole coil, and stood at the door with the end wrapped on his fist. They were gone 6 minutes. The rope brought them back like fish, snow-caked to the eyes, wind scalded, one man's hat gone, and his ears already turning stone white. Grange himself gasping like a man pulled from underwater. They had not seen the light again. They had not seen anything at all, including each other. Nobody argued with the brakeman after that. The proof had been bought cheap, and everyone aboard knew it. Then Frank took his lantern and did the sums the night demanded. Coal in the coach stoves, one night burned careful. Food, lunch baskets, a hamper here and there, and Pike's sample cases. Water, a world of it, frozen, one kettle at a time. Help, coming if the engineer lived to raise the wire, but no plow could fight this wind. Whatever was coming, it was coming after the storm, and the storm had the look of a stayer. It was Pike, the drummer, who broke the first ice among the passengers. He hauled his 2 sample cases down the aisle, opened them on a seat like a peddler at a fair, and turned out canned beef, canned peaches, crackers, coffee, and a ceremonial jar of horehound candy for the Vacek children. Compliments of the house, he said, and the car laughed for the first time since the cut. But laughter is not heat. By midnight, the 3 stoves were fighting for their lives and losing, and the smallest Vacek child was crying with the cold in a way that stopped conversations. Frank stood at the end of the aisle and made the count that the next 2 days would stand on. 3 cars, 3 stoves, 1 night of coal. Or 1 car, 1 stove, and 3 nights, maybe more. The train was going to have to get smaller. In the gray of the first morning, Frank Delaney announced that the train was now 1 car long, everyone into the day coach. The smoker and the rear coach would be abandoned to the cold, stripped, sealed, and left. 1 stove, fed properly, could hold 1 car, and 40 people in 1 car would do something the passengers had not thought of. They would heat it themselves. 40 bodies are their own stove. Packed close, breathing in 1 room, they were worth more than the coal they no longer had. Grange announced that he had not paid fare to ride in a bunkhouse. Frank did not argue with him. He simply went to the cold rear coach, gathered the 3 Vacek children, and carried them one by one to the seats nearest the day coach stove. Then he went back for their mother's baskets. By the time he was done, the argument had frozen to death on its own. Grange came up the aisle with his valise and sat where there was room, which was beside the Ott family, and nobody said anything at all. The move took the morning, and it was good work, the kind that warms the workers twice. Every cushion out of the abandoned cars went over a window or under a child. Every blanket, every curtain, every scrap of carpet was carried forward and packed into the day coach's seams. Then Frank took them outside. Volunteers in shifts, wrapped to the eyes, and did the thing that looked, to town people, like madness. They buried their own car. Snow was the enemy. Snow was also the only building material on the prairie, and the section gangs had taught Frank what it was worth. Banked against the walls, it slowed the wind that stole heat from the boards. They shoveled with seat boards, lunchbox lids, and bare planks until the drift reached the windows. Frank kept the roof vents and the space around the stovepipe clear. Warmth was useless if smoke and coal gas could not escape. From outside, when they finished, the shelter of 40 people looked like a drift with a stovepipe. From inside, for the first time in 2 days, the floor was not stealing feet. Old Hobbs, laid flat across a seat with his broken hip splinted in umbrella ribs and window strap, watched the brakeman work and gave him the only thing left in his gift. Not a speech, a nod in front of the car. The train was Frank's. That night, the 40 slept in one warm fog of breath and lamp smoke, rotating on Frank's watch. The people along the cold outer seats trading places, hour by hour, with the people in the warm middle, so that no one owned the good seats or was left to own the bad ones. And in the morning, the coal scuttle scraped bottom. Outside, it was 30 below and falling. The storm had not moved, and the only fuel left on 40 miles of prairie was the train itself. Frank Delaney had thought it through in the night, and when he laid it out, it had the shape of a rule, not a plea. They would burn the train from the tail forward. The rear coach came first, stripped stick by stick, while the smoker stood untouched, and the smoker after it. The day coach they lived in would remain whole. They chose bare structural wood before painted or heavily varnished pieces, though even clean-looking boards could foul the stove and had to be fed sparingly. The stove would get 1 armload an hour by his watch. Cold was not the vote. The watch was the vote. The axe crews went out in pairs, and the rear coach began to come apart in a way that was almost tidy. Wrenches first where wrenches worked, the axe where they didn't. Seat frames stacked in the vestibule like stove wood. The aisle of the abandoned car opening up, bench by bench, into a bare wooden hall. Grange objected once more, on principle. The company would bill somebody for a burned coach, and it would not be the company's brakeman who could pay it. It was old Ott, the farmer, who answered him, mildly, without looking up from the stove. They don't collect from frozen men. The car laughed, and the objection died of it, and Frank never had to say a word. The room was starting to govern itself. The trouble, when it came from kindness, not greed. In the small hours of that night, with the children whimpering in their sleep from the cold, old Ott slipped the count. He fed the stove double, then double again. For the children, only for the children, until the firebox roared and the stovepipe glowed a hard cherry red, and the dry ceiling board around the roof jack began to smoke. Frank came awake to the smell every railroad man is bred to fear: fire. In the one car on earth they could not spare. He was up the ladder and onto the roof with a bucket of snow while the car came awake shouting beneath him. And it took snow, and more snow, and a wet blanket jammed at the collar of the pipe, and long black minutes before the glow died and the board quit smoking. Then he came down and stood at the stove and did not raise his voice, because the lesson was not about the old man. Too much fire kills faster than too little. A stove run wild can take the car in 10 minutes. The cold outside needed 30 hours. The ration was not stinginess. The ration was the wall they lived behind, on both sides of it. He did not shame Ott, and he did not need to. The old man was gray with what he had nearly done. Frank handed him the watch instead, and the count. From that night on, it was Ott who called the armloads, Ott who guarded the stove from every kind mercy in the car, and no one on that train ever kept a ration more fiercely than the man who had broken it. By the end of the 3rd day, the rear coach was a skeleton on wheels, rams and rods and a bare frame, picked clean as a Sunday chicken. The smoker's turn came, and the axes moved forward a car. The storm had not moved at all, and the coldest night of that whole iron February was still ahead of them. The bottom of the cold came on the third night, and it came down like a press. Outside, no one knew the number, and it was better not to. The last thermometer aboard had quit at the bottom of its scale. Nails cracked off in the abandoned cars with sounds like far-off rifle work. In the baggage car, Pike's remaining sample tins froze hard enough to split their seams. The snow squeaked under boots at a pitch that section men know and hate. Inside the last warm car, frost bloomed in the corners a body's length from the stove, and the stove, held to its lawful arm load, could do no more than hold the line. So Frank made the world smaller one more time. The 40 moved into the middle third of their own car, a wall of seat frames and cushions built across the aisle at each end, the cold thirds abandoned like the cold cars before them. Less room, more people to the board foot. The same law that had saved them twice applied for the third time. In the packed middle, in the fug of 40 breaths, the children stopped shivering and slept. It was Pike who kept the room human through the worst of it. Somewhere past midnight he stood up, gaunt and grinning, and held an auction of dinners that did not exist. He sold a Kansas City steak with fried onions to the highest bidder for a promise. He sold a Christmas goose. He sold Mrs. Ott's own biscuits back to Mr. Ott for everything in his pockets, and the old man paid it, laughing till he wheezed. It was foolishness, and it was worth an armload of hardwood to that car, and Frank counted it into the fuel as honestly as the seats. Then the smallest Wachek boy went quiet in his mother's arms, that gray, boneless quiet that every Plains adult in the car knew on sight, and the car did its final piece of becoming one thing. They packed the boy into the warm middle of the middle, between strangers' bodies, wrapped in what there was. And Aldous Grange, banker of the first-class manners, stood up without a word, took off the great bear coat he had kept buttoned through everything, and laid it over the child. He got it back 2 days later. He never got back the man who had boarded in it, and by every account, he never wanted him back. Frank's own bad hour came on the roof, alone, in the black, where nobody could watch him have it. He was the youngest man on the crew. He had buried one car and burned two, on his own word, against the judgment of men who owned banks. And if no plow came, he would have burned a train for nothing and led 40 people to a cold end in a snowbank, and no rule book on the road would stand behind a brakeman who did it. The fear was not of the cold. The fear was of being wrong at the head of a column of 40. What answered him was not courage, it was the wires. All through the storm, every time he had gone up for snow or signal work, the telegraph wires along the line had been singing, that high, mad harp note that hard wind pulls out of iron on the plains, days of it, so constant the ear quit reporting it. Frank stood on the roof of the last car in the blackness and listened, and heard the thing the section gangs had taught him to hear. Nothing. The wires had stopped singing. The wind aloft was dying. The storm was breaking, hours yet at ground level, but breaking. He stood a long minute in the enormous new silence, and then he went down inside and said not one word about it. Because hope, fed too early, burns a room faster than a wild stove. He shortened the ration one more notch and waited to be sure. The third dawn came up still and clear and murderously cold, the kind of morning the plains keep behind their worst storms, where the whole sky rings like struck iron and nothing moves for 100 miles. The cut was a smooth white field. Of the train, from a distance, there was this to see: a stovepipe standing out of a drift with a straight gray feather of smoke on it. A buried engine. 2 skeleton cars, stripped to their frames, standing in the snow like something long dead. And nothing else at all. Frank went up with his last signal work, the red flag from his brakeman's kit, wired to a seat-back stanchion on the roof, and his lantern beside it, against the coming dark he no longer believed in. Then he put his bare ear to the rail, the way the section men do, and held it there until it ached. The rail was trembling. It trembled long before there was anything to hear. Then the rail began to hum. At last, the white east end of the cut burst open and a rotary plow came through, throwing snow high above the train. Two engines shoved behind it, men clinging to the running boards. Inside the last car, 40 people began shouting at once. The engineer and the fireman were on the first engine. They had made the section house on their own legs that first night, half dead, and raised the wire, and then stood at a window for 2 days while the storm held every plow on the division by the throat. What the relief crews found in that cut, they told for the rest of their railroading lives. 2 coaches burned down to the iron, in perfect order, like a cigar smoked to the band. 1 coach banked to the glass in snow, with a ceiling board scorched brown over the stove, and inside it, packed in the warm middle third around one lawful fire, 40 passengers, whole, frost-nipped, hungry, filthy, laughing, alive. The train had eaten itself from the tail forward, car by car, seat by counted seat, and had stopped eating at the door of the one car that mattered. The cost was small enough to fit in 2 hands, and Frank Delaney carried most of it there. Split knuckles, frost cracks, burn scars off the roofwork, hands that ached every February for 50 years. Hobbs's hip mended crooked and retired him to a depot office. Nobody on that train died. That February killed people all across the middle of the country. The accounts of the period run long, and the plains towns each had their own. But on that branch line, in that cut, the storm got no one. The company, which billed everybody for everything, never billed anyone for 2 burned coaches. It had read the letter first, the letter signed by 40 passengers, banker's hand at the top of the list. Aldous Grange wrote the line the division never forgot, that he had been commanded for 60 hours by a brakeman, and never in his life better governed. Frank Delaney got a conductor's punch the next year, and the division of his own before he was done. And in every yard he ever worked, the new men got told the story the way railroad men tell everything, trimmed to one sentence and true. 60 hours snowbound, 1 stove for 40 passengers, and the brakeman burned the seats in a strict order.